Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today is a Patreon request from The Tribe Has Spoken. I'm talking about the 2022 debut album from SLANDER, Thrive. Alright, I guess today it's time to go back over to the world of mainstream EDM as we talk about the duo of producers Derek Anderson and Scott Land, together known as SLANDER. They've been at it since the mid-2010s, putting out various tracks and remixes and EPs and the like, and they seem to be pretty well connected in the scene, having released projects both on the Monster Cat and Mad Decent labels in the past, and collaborated with artists like Nightmare, Adam K, Seven Lions, Illenium, Cruella, Excision, Subtronics, AU5, Alice in Wonderland, and plenty more around that particular sphere. They've also done remixes for artists including DJ Snake, Bastille, Adele, Jack U, Halsey, Showtek, and Kill the Noise, among others. Though possibly what first started to break them out to a wider audience was doing a remix for the trance outfit Above and Beyond in 2014, taking one of their usual Aryan Heavenly trance formulas, specifically their song Love Is Not Enough, and turning it into a trap-influenced future-bass mix, which apparently gained notoriety as a pioneering moment for a small subgenre of EDM called Heaven Trap. Now, Heaven Trap was the genre descriptor given to me when this request was first sent in, and I distinctly remember seeing that and thinking, fuck out of here if that's a real genre name. And of course they're dead serious about it, because this is mainstream EDM from the mid-2010s we're talking about, obviously. However, that isn't really as relevant to the discussion. This is their debut album from 2022, which apparently saw them trying to get a little more ambitious than what they were known for before. The album started life in 2019 when they put out a single called Love Is Gone with singer Dylan Matthew, which apparently got some decent traction on TikTok during the pandemic. Specifically an acoustic piano ballad version, because TikTok. But building off the conceit of the original EDM version of the track and its elaborate CGI music video, they evolved it into what they advertised as a loose concept record about an astronaut going out to space to find a new home for mankind. And I guess his brain gets scanned by aliens and he relives all his memories on Earth or something, I don't know. But in the press release where they explained the concept and inspiration, they also mentioned that they intentionally left the story vague and open to interpretation so that people would be able to more easily connect their own experiences and memories to it. To quote Scott Land directly, I feel like a lot of the songs that we found have connected with our fan base are highly emotional but very relatable songs about love. Love is something that most people get to experience, and everyone has experienced it in their own ways, both positive and negative. And I think that specifically with the songs that Derek and I have been able to give to the world, people really gravitate to those songs about love. If it's about heartbreak and they went through a really bad heartbreak, and that's the song that speaks to them, and they feel vulnerable enough and feel like they can think about that really hurtful moment, but feel okay doing so because of the song they're listening to, maybe it really channels the energy for them and helps them let go a little bit. Okay, so that was completely meaningless PR fluff. That just reads to me like they're describing a regular old mainstream EDM album and trying to present it as being more unique and far-reaching than it actually is, and minor spoilers, yeah, put any ideas of this being a concept record out of your mind, because there is absolutely no allusion to any kind of science fiction theme or even any overarching story in the lyrics at all. All of the lyrics are just your typical generic love and heartbreak songs that you would already expect out of mainstream EDM. At their true core, SLANDER are part of that grand tradition of more self-serious EDM producers that especially rose up in the second half of the 2010s, that tried to hit on big, heavy emotions and feel really important and meaningful. Porter Robinson really kicked off that trend being a thing when he put out Worlds in 2014, but I feel like the more indicative poster boy of that style, and the popular producer SLANDER probably reminded me the most of, was Illenium. I'll freely admit to only having heard one Illenium album in its full entirety as of recording this, that being his breakout debut album, Ashes. All his subsequent projects I've only kind of loosely skimmed and iTunes previewed through out of not having the patience for it, and much of his stuff kind of sounding the same to me outside of all the weird rock crossovers he's had in more recent years. But yeah, I've just never been able to get into that guy's work. I find his stuff to be monumentally tedious, and all the attempts to hit on big, heavy emotions or approach through compositions that feel really basic and rudimentary to me. Very plain, vanilla future-based mixes and forgettable pop hooks with drops that can maybe hit decently hard sometimes, but feel like they're trying to assign a greater level of importance to themselves without actually having any real substance to them to back it up. Now, I do understand that these artists do obviously have huge followings who adore their stuff and find the universal simplicity of it all to resonate with them on a deeper level. And hey, if that is your bag, more power to you. Just as a reminder for anyone less familiar with my taste, I have obviously never been one to reject this entire genre out of hand. I think there's plenty of quality to come out of the mainstream EDM world even beyond its greatest cultural ubiquity throughout the 2010s. And there is a good reason I still semi-periodically check up on what's going on in that scene. But I do very frequently struggle with albums of this particular stripe, especially when it comes to the most radio-friendly stuff that came out of the latter half of the 2010s. There's so much stuff that feels so bland and uninteresting and focus grouped, and their self-seriousness takes all the fun out of the experience and becomes a chore to get through super quick. See my feelings on this requester's previous request for that Alan Walker album for another prime example of some of the worst that scene can do. So yeah, with all of that background, I was going into this SLANDER album with the most rock bottom of expectations. I figured I was all but predisposed to dislike whatever they were gonna do here. And perhaps you've peeked at the description and already know where this is going, but I think you can probably imagine my surprise when it turned out I thought this album was perfectly alright. I'm not gonna say I think it's great, or that there aren't plenty of very legit reasons to outright dislike this album. All the criticisms I've already brought up still stand, both in terms of the supposed concept mattering so little to the point of bordering on false advertising, and also just my typical reservations with this particular stripe of super mainstream-friendly, emotional EDM. You are still getting a lot of super rudimentary compositions here with lots of basic 4 chords of pop chord progressions and anonymous vocal guest features ready-made to fit into the schedule of radio pop filler. But I did not mind the listening experience this album provided. I even thought it might border on halfway decent. For one thing, I do feel like the production and mastering job on the entire album is surprisingly really strong, which is definitely not guaranteed for albums in this genre. There is a tendency of these kinds of future-based projects, mainstream or otherwise, to have mastering jobs which can feel really flat and or blown out, like they're just hitting you with blaring synth chords without any sense of subtlety. But this album did genuinely create a really strong sense of spaciousness with all of its mixes that feel very open-sounding and large-scale, while also being very full-sounding and well-balanced in terms of like the frequency spectrum, with no sounds in the mix getting like swamped out, either in build-ups or drops. If there was anything about this album that might evoke the theme of outer space like they actually advertised it to, it would just be that loose, open-ended feeling of spaciousness that the mixing and mastering job is able to hit upon. So major props to whoever the mastering engineer was on this album. I couldn't find any credits list to confirm who it was specifically. It might just be the duo themselves, seeing as the album was technically self-released, but I don't know. Don't quote me on that. The other nice thing about this album, which is also not something you're guaranteed to get out of this brand of mainstream radio pop EDM, is the fact that I can actually tell the 10 tracks on this album apart from each other. And it doesn't feel like one of those albums where they're just cycling through a bunch of different mainstream EDM trends and throwing shit at the wall to see what sticks. I do just feel like they were able to give each of these tunes their own identities within the narrow purview of their one specific style, just barely falling within that balance of having a sense of variety, but without feeling incohesive. I'm not going to say that balance is maintained perfectly throughout the record or act like there aren't moments that drag or turn me off, but I have definitely heard albums in this genre that did a far worse job of maintaining my attention than this album did. I didn't feel like it was an outright chore to get through, and I do have to give it props for that too. The album does start out pretty nicely. The opener, Kill Me With Silence, may start out with like a generic 4 chords of pop piano progression, and the vocal guest, Medic, sounds like your standard radio pop EDM vocal guest without any real personality. But the mix is also given this really extravagant movie trailer orchestral backdrop that sounds really big and impressive in a way that's somewhat able to mask the underlying basicness of the composition and make it feel more sincere and meaningful than it might have otherwise. And once we get into the proper EDM tracks in their usual style, with cuts like Nothing Hurts Like Goodbye with Kiara, and Replay with Dylan Matthew, again, they stick to a super rudimentary formula with super plain pop build-ups and future-based drops, but the tension and release is satisfying, the pop hooks are decently catchy and well-constructed. They may be done-to-death formulas, but they're at least doing that formula with just good enough tunes to be able to carry it. Again, the vocals don't exactly have much personality. I did not expect to ever see Kiara's name again, considering my only other exposure to her was like her one mainstream hit, where she sounded like a YTP going over like a mid-2010s DJ Mustard beat. I suppose being a generic EDM singer is probably a better fit for her than that, but it's not like she brings anything to the table vocally that any other female EDM guest singer wouldn't be able to. Dylan Matthew is probably the most emotive singer to feature on this album, which is not saying much, but he is a decently comforting presence, and I thought he sounded nice on all his performances on this thing. Certainly, I will take him or Kiara over Ashley Drake's much bassier and off-puttingly throatier delivery on a track like Halfway Down. I mean, he sounds decent enough during the drop of the song, but his verses sound awful, and this is the first dud for me in the track listing, in the beginning of a pretty weak stretch in the middle of this album that shows just how thin a line these basic radio pop compositions really are walking on. Monster with Nightmare is another dud for me. The vocals are just kind of there, the tune is forgettable, and the drop is probably the most annoying drop on the album. Has a tiny bit of that like Avicii-esque squeaky quality to its melodic synths. It's not unlistenable by any stretch, but it's definitely another point at which my interest is just dropping off. The album's big hit and centerpiece, Love Is Gone, is a step back in the right direction. No, I don't care that this track was already out for 3 years before the album even came out. There are times when tacking on a bigger hit to get more eyes on an album feels like this forced and cynical move that signals a lack of faith in the rest of the work. But this does not feel like an example of that. Their statements about the whole album having been written around this track as the initial point of inspiration, that does track to me. Not saying I think the track is like a particular highlight for me, necessarily. I do think the actual tune and melody is again a little on the mind-numbingly basic side, and one of the weaker and more annoying tunes on display here. Although this track is at least more interesting and has more moving parts to it than any other track on the album. There's like this big percussive build-up in the middle, a wobbly future bass drop that, while quite off-putting, doesn't sound like any of the other drops on the album. There's also a random slowdown in tempo at the end. It is probably the most unpredictable track on the album, which, again, may not be saying much, but I do appreciate the tiny bits of flavor it is able to provide. Certainly more so than that track's supposed Part 2, Walk on Water, that comes right after it, and which is way less interesting and falls way flatter for me. I guess some of the vocal harmonizing that Dylan Matthew and the other guest singer Rory do throughout the track is kinda nice, but the latter singer has like an overly cutesy tone to her voice in the parts when she's singing by herself. It gets quite grating. It kinda reminds me of like BB Rexa a little bit, I guess. And the track has no damn business being 6.5 minutes long. I mean, if it had a bunch of weird out-of-nowhere change-ups like Love Is Gone did, that'd be one thing, but this track has, like, no progression to it at all. It just stays in that emotional ballad mode through its full running time and is easily the most tedious and sluggish track in the bunch. By this point, I was definitely starting to wonder whether I was giving this album too much credit in its beginning moments, although immediately after this point, they throw quite the out-of-nowhere left hook in the track listing, which definitely caught my attention a heck of a lot more than maybe anything else in the album up to that point. The tracks Before Dawn and Second Life sound absolutely nothing like anything else on the album. It's an abrupt shift over to this heavily banging industrial techno style, like they're doing their equivalent to an artist like Surgeon or something. or maybe what Carl Cox would go on to do with his album later the same year. Nearly all the melody goes away in favor of massive pounding kicks and aggressive buzzing synths that kind of just drone over them. Now, I would understand if these tracks threw people off so much to the point where it took them out of the experience altogether. I certainly did not see such a massive tone shift coming, but I more than welcomed it. This was easily the most exciting part of the album for me, and it shows them directly bucking against the radio friendliness of the rest of the album in a way that I found refreshing, but also maintaining the generally spacious vibe so as not to feel like it's being made by completely different artists. The two tracks, for the record, may be functionally identical, but I like how Before Dawn has like this random piano digression in the middle, which makes the track sort of feel like they're equivalent to something like deadmau5's Terrors in My Head. And while Second Life pretty much copy-pastes the exact same groove and borders on making it start to feel monotonous in its first half, it does salvage itself once we hit that part with those really nice string pads in the middle. Even if I wouldn't say this is like the most mind-blowing industrial techno I've ever heard or anything, the fact that an album like this took such an out-of-left-field turn like this and got it to feel even somewhat natural won it quite a few respect points in my eyes. Finally, the album closes with Watch Over Me, which returns back to the radio friendliness the rest of the album focused on, although in a different form from many of the other tracks. It's kind of a breezy tropical house track that maintains the same tempo as those industrial tracks leading up to it, and kind of ends up feeling like a refreshing exhale of relief at the end. To be fair, the tune is pretty generic and nondescript if you just take it on its own. If you were to put it as is on like a Kygo album or something, I don't think I would find anything special about it. But sequencing it in the exact way they did does allow it to hit with more effectiveness than it ever would have otherwise, so even if it's not a highlight, I'll still say it's an ending that left me decently satisfied. So yeah, that's everything on Slander's Thrive. I'll say this, it exceeded my expectations for it. I don't know how much of a recommendation that actually translates to, unless you're a fan of this particular brand of mainstream radio pop EDM and can get past the really straightforward generic blandness of some of these compositions. I don't know if I'd say this is really worth going out of your way for. And I also don't know how much of a crossover there is between the audience that likes this kind of stuff and the audience that would get more into, like, those two out-of-nowhere industrial techno cuts. There's a bit of a leap, and I wouldn't be surprised if I came closer into getting into both than most people would. I'd be lying if I said I got so much out of this album where I'd ever see myself listening to it again after I post this video, but again, I went in expecting this album to either be really cringy off the promise of genre terminology like Heaven Trap, or a straight snooze fest off of the promise of my biases against the actual scene this duo is playing to. And to their credit, it was not either of those. There were a couple of decent pop hooks that could carry the opening stretch well enough. The album never outright bored me aside from maybe Walk on Water. It was well sequenced and well produced, certainly better mastered than the average I tend to expect out of this genre. And even if absolutely nothing here exactly moved me emotionally, they did find a way to make it feel sincere enough to them, and I can believe they thought they were doing something that felt special to them here. I don't know, nothing here set the world on fire, but I thought it was alright. It wasn't that bad. I think I can let it off with a solid 6 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.